Good afternoon, everyone. Today is Wednesday, July 12th. This is a Town Council Finance Committee meeting. It's 5 o'clock. I'll call this meeting to order and note that we have two regular members of the Finance Committee, myself and Councilor Hamel, and Council Chairs filling in for Councilor Shoup today. So we do have a full committee. Just have a few items to go over on the agenda. First, we'll start by approving the minutes from May 24th and 31st, 2023. Do I have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Any discussion? I agree. I think they were pretty straightforward. All those in favor? That passes unanimously. And then we have a couple of discussion items with possible action. The first is a review and possible action on bond authorization. This is something that we typically do once a year, but we haven't done it for several years now. And since 2021, I believe, was the last time. Bond authorization gives the treasurer and the chair of the town council, in most cases, the authority to sell bonds on the town's behalf for eligible projects or purposes. So we're, I think, playing a bit of catch up with this particular issuance because we haven't done it in so long. So we have a worksheet that's included with the packet that I think we can use to start the conversation. I don't know if we can bring that up. So a lot of people are going to love these conversations. There's a lot of numbers, a lot of data, some color coding. This was provided by staff last week, and it is really focused on what we need to sell for bonds. And then in order to make that sale, what authorizations need to happen. So the blue column here is the proposal for the bonds that would need to be ordered. And the green column is the proposal for the bonds that will be sold. The bonds that will be sold is really up. It's a town staff decision in conjunction with the chair of the council that happens in consultation with our bond advisor or financial advisor. The authorizing those bonds to be sold is a council action. So I spent some time with this. I think we got it in the middle of last week. Identified that some of the items in yellow where we thought we may have had outstanding bond authorizations, we actually did not. So I added those. And then I also went through, and there's some projects that we're executing from the past few years' capital plans that we don't have bond authorizations for, that I thought it made sense to make sure that we do have those, the funding lined up for those projects. And I've talked with Tom a couple of times. There's some of the stuff is a little fluid. So for example, we had a project approved for Highland Ave pedestrian improvements that it hasn't gone to bid yet, but the engineering has been completed and it looks like it's going to cost somewhat more than had been anticipated. Similar issue with Spurwink Road project. So town staff is proposing that we shelf the Highland Ave project and use a portion of those, the bonds that would have been allocated to that project to fully execute the Spurwink Road project. And then there's we started this conversation in earlier in the year around trying to get our hands on what capital is out there that's approved. We went through a rescinding action. I took that a little bit of a step further, where there's some outstanding budget authorizations. They don't necessarily have bonds authorized for them, but they're no longer needed. The projects have been completed. So just to try to get a clean number of what's the potential exposure for spending, I've included some of those in the bond order. So Norma, do you want to talk through this any, or do you want me to jump ahead?
We can jump ahead if you'd like. I mean, I don't know. You summarized it pretty well.
Okay.
Just quick question though. Could you explain, you said when we go to sell a bond,
Yes.
can you explain the difference between the approval to appropriate to bond and then how the proceeds, how do we actually get money from that?
So I'm going to share. Can you stop sharing? I'm going to share my screen. And I think I'll be able to maybe walk through that.
Because I'm guessing most folks may not understand the steps. I couldn't explain it. So, but I know there's a process and kind of where we are in that.
So
Thanks.
it starts with the budget. Okay, so each year we approve a capital improvement plan, and the current year gets added to a stack of authorized projects. So those projects,
A prior approved capital plan.
yes, get budget authority. Okay, now budget authority is not necessarily an appropriation. In the past it was, but this year we didn't appropriate funds that were planned to be bonded. So for things that are funded by reserves or from the taxpayer, the funding happens at that time. When we pass the budget order, those funds are allocated right
Are
then.
approved or authorized by.
They're authorized to use,
spend.
town staff can use them. For items that require a bond issuance, there's another step. And that's where we, as a council, need to take action to authorize the issuance of bonds for that project. And that's where we are right now.
Two-step versus one-step process.
Well, it's 3 steps. So after we authorize the bonds, we're going to say at one time or from time to time, town staff and the chair of the council can sell bonds on the town's behalf for these projects. So we're going to authorize bonds for projects that we have already been approved and that are being executed. Town staff is going to look based on a whole number of factors and say, what do we want to issue for bonds? And some of that issuance is going to be based on prior approvals. So things that were approved either by the voters or by former councils or by the action that we're taking or we will take in the next couple of weeks or months.
And so that analysis it does involve looking at what we've spent to date. And also a forward look, what do we expect to spend over kind of the short term between now and the next time we issue bonds. And so there's a fairly detailed analysis that involves all senior staff in terms of give us an update where this project stands. Has it been started? Where is it? So on and so forth. So all of that comes into and informs what comes to the list of actually bonds we go to market with.
So and there's a timing effect, but there's also an amount, right? So on big projects, the first year or so, we might be paying only for interest, right? And then we, that steps up over time as construction begins, that kind of
It
thing.
can. So a lot of times when a project's approved, there's no immediate costs incurred. We're not going to sell bonds right away. We will as we need them. Okay. And then when you're paying for that, you can structure your bonds in different ways. Some of them could be interest only for a period.
Yep.
But yes, there's definitely a timing delay. From the point a project is approved to the point you issue bonds is typically a couple of years.
Yep.
For the bigger projects, it might happen over 3, 4, 5 years.
And with respect to the issuance of bonds, we further dissect the individual projects or items and determine the maturity, how long we should be borrowing for. And the financial and fiscal policy helps gives guidance in that regard in terms of the length of time. You're not going to bond a pickup truck for 20 years. It doesn't have the useful life. It will be 5 years, for instance. And so all of that comes out of and is reflected very clearly in our official statement, which is the offering to the folks to buy our bonds.
Which is placed by our bond salesman, or do we do it directly sometimes?
We use assistants to enter the bond market. Yes. Yep.
It is, yeah, I mean, I'm almost always, town staff is responsible for the official statement, but it's
We have
prepared with a lot of
professional
help.
Advisors.
There's a lot of detail in there.
And that advisor helps manage the actual sale.
Yeah.
And almost always we do a competitive sale as opposed to a negotiated.
So the way I have this kind of broken up is you start with your budget and you get different years. Then you have your bond orders, and these are actually actions by council. Right now I have this 2023 XX. That's the one that we're contemplating right now. So we're contemplating an order that would authorize the issuance of up to 11.67 million of bonds. Should I try to zoom?
Can I ask a question about what you just said?
Yes.
How does that relate to the 9.7 million? How does that relate to the 9.7 million in the packet?
So the 9.7 million the 9.7 million is the amount that we expect to sell.
Okay.
Again, this is a distinction between what you're authorizing us to sell doesn't tell us that we have to sell it now. It just gives us the authorization to use when we think it's necessary. And so the difference is the 9.7 is what we actually have a need for and will go to market for.
So we would authorize up to that amount, but these are the projects that we feel like are,
that are
Needed?
ready for funding today.
Okay.
So some of them.
Probably the biggest one there, John, was probably the Mitchell Hill Road project. We're just at the front end of a $1.6 million project. But they're actively under construction. We're going to be spending money. So we know we're going to have to, might as well get the authorization now,
Exactly.
because the project's active.
So
And then
John,
there's
this-
another project in there that isn't expected to start until spring, so there's no need to go to market for that money yet.
yes,
And we anticipate being back on schedule for spring bond issues, so.
And John has convinced me that what we should be doing is almost commensurate with, maybe not part of the budget order, when you give me budget authorization. Shortly thereafter, if not simultaneously, I should be also seeking bond authority.
if we have this
Marry the-
conversation in the spring, it would-
Marry those very closely, because what's happened in the past is I get budget authority, we go about our merry way, and then it could be years before I come back and seek bond authority.
Mhm.
For whatever reason, the project's delayed or.
So in the future, it makes sense during the budget process to carve out an extra step for finance in their reviews to potentially look at this topic area, just to make sure we can,
or shortly thereafter.
okay.
I think getting back on a regular cadence, it would
Mhm.
be totally acceptable. It's okay for it to be disconnected
Yeah.
from the budget. And, when we do the bond authorization, we at times are amending the budget that was approved, and we've done that historically, and the way the bond order reads, that's what it's saying, we're appropriating the funds. What I tried to do with this is actually identify where those situations
Mhm.
happen.
In the cleanup that started with rescinding bond authority and that will follow along with, I guess, rescinding budget authority is that any unspent remaining balance for whatever reason, whether the project didn't happen or we didn't need all the money that was expected. Ruth's historical practice, she's been carrying that. And so there's decades of kind of smaller amounts that are just kind of carried along. So this is good, sound financial practice. And it really, I think, will provide Norm and his team kind of a clean starting point rather than all this kind of complicated baggage that has been kind of carried along.
So a little further down on the screen, you can see some of the big projects that you can sort it different ways. This is capital that's been included in the budget but hasn't been funded yet.
Mhm.
Obviously the big one's the school that requires voter approval, so that, that's out of our hands essentially. Voter approved land bond is the next biggest one. Mitchell Hill is up for authorization this time. Is a fairly substantial one. Spurwink Road is actually up this time. Oh, this is phase 2. So here's an example. This is something that was in the budget. We're just starting to plan for phase 1 of Spurwink Road. So it's not included in our bond authorization right now. And I think that's perfectly fine, because by the time we get to phase 2, we're probably going to know a little bit more about what the actual budget might be. But one thing that I think, if you sort of, based on the budget to be amended, this is the increase in cost for Spurwink Road that we're anticipating. And if I otherwise, there's not many, these increases are pretty nominal. They're not very big.
It's just a function of inflation or
Just what we spent.
Yeah.
We may have spent, a little bit over. Again, when we authorize these projects, it's not an exact science.
Don, on that one, we've gone to bid. I've not signed the bid because it's $400,000 over budget. And our proposal is that we use money from another similar project, the Highland project, which John has teed up there. We not proceed with that, but use that funding, and I need your approvals to do so, to actually move forward with Spurwink as originally scoped and envisioned.
Yes, that's where you see that is that, we're reducing the budget for the Highland project by 771,000.
Yep.
And increasing the Spurwink by 400,000, something plus or minus. But there is a bunch of other projects that we're also cleaning up at the same time. We approved Herd Park a few years ago. And it was never sent to the voters. It's in the capital plan in a future year right now, so Tom agreed that we should take this out of the approved budget. Same thing with some older projects, Eastern Trail from 2007. Just some things that are done. In some cases, we may have traded in vehicles to fund the missing piece. In other cases, it came in under budget. But we're for these items, we're fairly confident that we don't need the funds anymore.
Correct.
And I like to have a clean total to look back at. You know, right now, sorry. It's a little complicated to show. So what these three columns here are, I think, the relevant ones right now. The bonds to be authorized, 11.6 million. The bonds to be sold, and this could change a little bit based on, work that staff and bond counsel is going to do. So it looks like around 9.6 or 9.7 million. And then the budget amendment, we're actually reducing the capital budget by 2 million.
And that's a big chunk of that, like you just said, is from Herd Park, and the rest are.
That's 600,000.
It's mostly, so we're increasing for Spurwink, the 435,000. We're decreasing for Highland, 771,000, and then Herd Park, 631,000. And these
bunch
aren't
of other
nothing
ones.
either. Yeah, there's a bunch of small ones too.
Those small ones add up,
Mhm.
2 million in total.
Yeah.
So I didn't have this in the form of a bond order in time for today's meeting. I do have a sheet that I shared like hours ago with staff that I suspect they'll review. But I'm fairly comfortable moving I think we're anticipating this will take 2 readings at the council. There's an outstanding question for the school, a couple of school department items where I wasn't able to locate what they were requesting on the capital plan.
I think those outstanding questions don't relate to the bond authorization. They really relate more to the budget authority.
One of them relates to the bond authorization.
Is it?
Because I couldn't find the budget for
Oh, the security system one.
the
Yeah.
security
Fair
system.
enough.
one. The others, I found the projects.
Yeah.
And I think there was just confusion. I think they may have thought they were authorized for bonds when they weren't. Those bonds had been issued.
Yeah, as soon as I can connect with Kate, I think we can answer that one question.
Yeah, so we don't have anything, I don't have anything for formal action, but I want to see if there was support on the committee to move this to the full council for the next meeting. And then there will be a tangible bond order that everybody can look at, read, and opine on. And then there'll be another meeting before final approval takes place.
John, how do you envision dealing with the budget authority, rescinding that?
It's the same.
You think they'll
I view
be
it as the same action.
all part of the same action?
Yeah, so at the bottom here, there's a link to a spreadsheet. And I have this one broken out, bond order 2003, but this just identifies the project. We'll actually, when it gets on a council agenda, we'll fill this in with the actual bond order number. And then there's the bonds that are being authorized or ordered. And then the budget offset is the change in the capital budget for the project. If you include both of those items on the listing,
I was thinking about the third piece, which totals the $2 million in reduction of,
this budget offset will total
it does, okay.
the 2 million.
We're just looking at the top portion of ads, but all below it is
The subtractions.
subtractions.
Yes.
Yeah.
2,000,001.
Yeah.
thousand.
So as staff is fully on board for all 3 pieces, of the 3, what's most critical to me is really getting the bond authorization so we can begin that process, which does take 2 reads. So if we can get this in front of council on the 19th next week, we'll come back to you on August 16th. And we'd be in a position probably by mid-September to actually go to market.
And what's the total we're going to market for?
Just under 10 million. It's 9.6 right now. It might change by 85,000 depending on what we get answer from the school. That's the only variable that would change at this point.
And this follows a year or two where we were relatively flat, right? It was too.
We didn't borrow at
At
all.
all.
2 years and not borrow.
And historically, John, I think you looked at this, looking over the last couple of decades, we've been between $4 to $6 million in annual borrowing. So, I think we're still kind of in that normal zone, if you will.
So this chart is what we've actually sold for bonds in each year. But there's actually something each year up until 2022, there was nothing. So this does not look, 2023 does not look too much out of character. It's certainly not double 2020.
And those big spikes back in 12 and 14 are the one where school borrowing, that was 40 million-ish, 38. 18, what was 18?
Public safety.
Public safety, thank you. But you'll see the rest of that graph shows that there's a fair degree of consistency in terms of annual borrowing. And I would remind you, in the budget you just passed last month, we've actually made a pretty notable move to moving away from long-term finance and appropriating. And that's a practice that I think everyone is committed to seeing if we can stay on track with.
Mhm.
So I'd love to have that annual borrowing come down and be something less than 4 to 6.
In spite of that, it's never gonna be as, smooth, right? You're gonna have some big spikes because of large capital.
Yeah, that's why we use debt.
Timing of spending is gonna make that bar fluctuate.
And there's a strong philosophy or theory of borrowing. There are many items and projects that borrowing is a preferred method. Even if we had the cash, I would probably suggest that we at least consider borrowing. Buying a new fire truck, if you save it for 15 years, so you have $1 million to buy a fire truck, all the existing taxpayers for the last 15 years have saved the pennies to do that, whereas the use goes 20 years in the future. So there's a theory to behold here.
There's always a
Matching
tricky
principle.
in terms of who's paying for it, right?
Right.
You're leaving it for someone else to pay, or
And depending on interest rates, I think it's not a bad way of going. And we've shown the ability to stay very consistent in terms of the level of debt service as a percentage of our operating budget. And that piece is important because that's the fluctuation in that percentage is what really gives you spikes in your tax rate. If that ends up going higher or low off that kind of norm of 13% or so is what we 12 to 13 is where you see the spikes in tax rates. So that's how we've been able to manage it historically.
And I think we're in a period right now where we're not at 13% because our debt service has been coming down.
Yep.
But we're also funding, like Tom said, a lot of capital with appropriations.
Yep.
Yep. More so than we really, I think, ever have. It's a new debt service comes on. We may not be able to afford to do that quite to the same extent we are now, but.
Yeah, I think it related to that, we've also enjoyed many years of relatively low interest rates, so that
Yes.
may not last forever. So it's another thing to be thinking about.
How common is it for towns or for us to not borrow in a year? Because it was mentioned for 2 years we didn't. Why didn't we? And is that also a common practice?
I think 2 reasons we didn't. One, we were struggling with the COVID period, frankly, and I think we got distracted. And secondly, we really got caught up in a transition from a longtime finance director to a new finance director, and that really accounted for the reason we didn't do it this past spring.
So does that practically mean that we've been deferring projects because we didn't have? Bonds
Not
available?
necessarily. We've been paying for them with our own resources. So a big part of the 9.6 will be paying ourselves back for money we've already fronted.
Okay.
About 8 million of that is money that we've already expended.
Which may very well shore up our fund balance.
Okay, so that's where, as we bond and get that additional money, it would go towards fund balance to pay back a liability or something.
Basically, there was loans, I think, taking place internally,
Okay,
that this will eliminate some of those loans.
Okay.
And Norm's shared a practice that Tulsa took whereby they would actually sell bonds up front before the project or the items actually purchased. It gets tricky because you got to manage the money and the arbitrage rules apply. But that's another approach. And I've encouraged Norm to see if there's opportunities for us to do that as opposed to funding some of these things and then kind of paying ourselves back.
Mhm.
We're not a bank.
Any other questions or concerns? You good with seeing it on the council agenda?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Anything else from staff on that?
No, thank you.
Okay.
I'd like to work with you just to fine tune the actual order for council.
Yeah.
I have a quick question though. If we are having a single action meeting potentially on August 2nd, is time of the essence to put this on, or is waiting until September for the second?
I
read?
prefer sooner than later. Interest rates are still questionable. I'd rather get to markets sooner than later. So if that's an opportunity, we should take it.
So in an ideal world, these projects that were executed would have been authorized for bonding a while ago, and
Yeah.
staff would have had the flexibility to commit more quickly and
Mhm.
maybe leverage, take advantage of better interest rates or better market conditions. So that's one of the things we're trying to correct for.
Just a final piece, what we've done in the past and what I promised to you as a finance committee is to the extent that we have time with competitive sales, we often have to make decisions quickly in terms of award. But to the extent that we can convene the committee, there's very often decisions to be made in terms of what to do with bid premium if some is associated. And it's been helpful to staff to get others involved in that decision making. So to the extent that we can coordinate that, we will.
One question I had is, going back to your memo there that requested, budget approval for the Spurwink Road and the Highland Avenue related projects. So the one thing I kind of dropped off the screen for me was I thought we had a Pine Point road work in the queue somehow. Is that just not related to this at all, or is that on a different time schedule?
That's a project that is in our 5-year capital plan, but it's doesn't have budget authority nor.
A date,
Hasn't been approved yet.
right? Okay.
Right. We'll get some blacktop down this
I
summer,
was gonna say, I think somebody's doing something down.
It's all
but
about.
that's a Band-Aid at best, I'll admit.
And then there's some walk work that I don't know that is
Yes.
fully defined where it's gonna
Yeah.
apply to, but there's some funding there for it.
Mixed buzz about that one, but yeah, I think people are looking forward to, some work there. So.
Okay. The next item up was, we received a report from our auditor, Markham. It's called a single audit report. Honestly, a lot of the lingo in there is a little bit beyond me, so I'm gonna pass it to Norm
Yeah,
to
please.
handle this one, please.
You want to put it up on the screen? Please. Thank you. This is the CFA, which is an acronym for Schedule of Expenditures of Federal Awards. And it's an annual report that you send to the federal government and you report to them exactly what it says, how much you've spent on out of grants that you've been awarded from federal agencies. And it requires an audit, and it's in conjunction with your financial audit. The threshold is 750,000. If you spend less, you're not required in a given year, and we're over that amount. So that's the reason for the audit. So if we can toggle down.
And the majority of these federal monies go to benefit the school. Not exclusively, but the vast majority of any federal monies are school related.
Let's go down to page.
Paper copy.
Yeah, no, let's go to page number 3 in the opinion. Yeah, go down to page 3. Really, all I want to point out in this section is the opinion from the auditors. We're always after a clean opinion, and right above the heading, go down just a little farther. Page numbered. See the numbers in the right hand corner.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you'll go to page numbered. Go a little farther. Page 3, there you go. All right, it's right there where it says basis of opinion. If you'll look above that, the paragraph, that's where they state their opinion. And we've complied with all material respects of the compliance requirements for the grant. So that's what we're looking for, to get a clean opinion, and we received that. Now if we will go down to the actual schedule where the numbers are.
It's page 6.
Yeah. The schedule outlines what the grant is, the federal number for the grant, whether or not if it's a pass-through from another agency, we list that identifying number, and we report how much of those funds that were passed through that we spent. Otherwise, that far right-hand column outlines what we spent out of the grant, and each grant you see listed there, we have to report how much was spent in the fiscal year. The first half is primarily school-related grant funds from various sources, meal programs and the like, education type grants. And then the second page, we get into the town grants. The largest individual grant is from the Office of National Drug Control Policy, the HIDTA, High Intensity Drug Trafficking Agency. The grant covers salaries, benefits, it covers the whole program. We administer that program.
That's right. We're the fiduciary for this regional organization. New England Hydro.
5.3 million. That's a big number.
So
And we get paid for our purpose, for providing the fiduciary support. We get paid, I believe, 3% of their grant award. So it's a couple $100,000. It's received as a revenue in the finance department.
So, not to jump ahead, was the deficiency that we were administrating a regional program but didn't include it in our?
in our grant funds on the financials. Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. Exactly. So what I wanted to point out was, out of the 9.656 of federal spending between the town and school, 5.3 of it was one individual program. So from a numbers of grants, the school has more grants than the town. From a dollar perspective, the HIDTA grant vastly overwhelms.
And if you take school and hideout, town alone, just doing the quick math, it's about $80,000 a grant.
Yeah.
4 different grants, so fairly small from a dollar perspective for town only.
So that's all I want to do on the schedule. If you'll skip down to the schedule of findings and question costs. This is where the auditors report the results of their audit, basically. We did have the material weaknesses that we spoke about. The other questions, there were no issues with internal controls or and then the final question is, are we a low risk auditee? And the answer is yes. So the impact of that question, if the answer were no, if we're not a low risk, a high risk, then that triggers additional test work the auditors would have to do, which translates into more fees for the audit. So as long as we keep that answer yes as a low risk auditee, that helps us keep our audit fees lower than what they could be. If we advance to the next page, we get into the findings. So the type A program cluster, that speaks to the school's grants. The previous audit firm prepared the CFA in 21. And a cash basis report that's on file with the state was used and didn't pick up some accruals. So there were expenses that weren't audited that should have been audited in 21. They had to audit them in 22, and we incurred some additional costs for that. And material weakness, so that's been corrected. Inclusion of the HIDA in the special revenue funds and the ACFR, that happened in 22, so that's corrected. And then the other item that was previously reported was the carrying the sick and vacation liability in the general fund, which that was corrected on the audit, so.
So that was basically just misclassification. It wasn't like an error in how we were
Exactly.
calculating it or how.
Exactly. Yeah, let me, Liam, if you wouldn't mind going back up to that page where we had the yes, nos. There's a question on there about question costs. And the answer to that is no. So all of our costs with all of these grants were legitimate and eligible to be expended through the grant program. The material weakness came about with the timing of when it was reported.
So can I ask you just another question about the, calculation of time off, that issue? I mean, it doesn't refer to the issue here necessarily, but compensated absences, I guess, are, that's a significant accounting policy, right, of ours?
Yes,
And so, and that has to do with union contracts, vacation and sick leave in varying amounts, and how we record it as a liability, but we only do it when it's matured. And as a result of paid time off for resignations or retirement. So this does go back to the schedule change we talked about. Because this is a, significant accounting policy, have we, are we going to have any impact on that this year in terms of the change and through the 4-day work week? And I've asked this question previously, of Liam and also of Tom, that indicated that there is no quote unquote significant financial, fiscal impact, I think is the word. So is this going to affect that area in any way?
no, there's no impact on the fiscal balance of what will drive the change in the liability is years of service accumulating.
Right.
And however much of that is used in an individual year.
Okay.
So those two things will impact the change in the liability. So if I use all my sick time that's granted in a year, then my liability is not going to change. The other, then that's a policy, not only a union contract, but it's a policy for the non-sworn that they're allowed to carry their vacation and sick.
So beyond the accounting aspects, there are policy considerations. We have historically funded 100% of that liability.
Yep.
And I believe, let me make sure I get this right, had historically categorized that as restricted fund balance,
Assigned fund balance.
signed. The reality is there's really not a conceivable scenario whereby that liability would all occur at once.
Right.
And so we've loosened that up a bit as part of the audit as well, in terms of how we categorize.
So we accrue the liability, but it's paid out over time as people retire and that sort of thing. So otherwise there's not a budget impact. Because I don't remember us having any discussion about this in detail when we went through the budget process, that there would be any need to change the.
Don, we do budget in the annual budget, the expected annual liability
Yeah.
for retirements and separations and so on and so forth. Separate and apart from that, from an audit perspective, we again have historically funded the liability 100%.
Yeah.
And that was probably overly conservative,
Right.
frankly, because it's really not conceivable that we'd ever need all of that at once.
Yeah, you hear that term quite often as it relates to pension liability, unfunded liabilities. I know there have been historically big issues, with that, at a state and local level. So, okay, that answers my question. Thank you.
That's all I had on this report.
So is there any follow-up work with this, or is this all closed now? It's all, the management actions are all.
This gets filed in the Federal Clearinghouse, which was done on June 30th. There's no follow-up because all I'll take that back. When the audit firm comes back next year to audit, fiscal 23, they will look back to this and they will, even though we've said, yes, we've corrected these weaknesses, they will do a verification process in their test work. So that's really the only follow-up that will happen.
In some of these programs, if we're not in compliance, the reimbursement that we received or would receive could be at risk, right?
Exactly. If we had question costs, then we would be seeing desk audits from the granting agency and some closer scrutiny around our spending on these grants.
I mean, the good news is the audit looked pretty clean, in spite of the issues that we had with it. And I've talked about this numerous times, with Norman and Tom and others, but it's interesting to me, sometimes in the audit, and this is the case as well with a memo that came with the reports that we just reviewed. Sometimes those things speak more about what the work doesn't cover versus what the work does cover. So I'm just going to quote from that. Quote, we would consider the town of Scarborough's internal control over financial reporting, in parentheses, internal control, as a basis for designing audit procedures that are appropriate in the circumstances for the purpose of expressing our opinions on the financial statements, but not for the purpose of expressing an opinion on the effectiveness of the town of Scarborough's internal control. Accordingly, we do not express an opinion on the effectiveness of the town of Scarborough's internal control. So I want to spend a moment on that. I know, and Tom and I've talked with Liam about it as well. This, in the interest of the work we've been doing to try to get better handle on our financial pictures. I think that we need to put a marker down for funding this type of review, in the next cycle, so that we can use that as a tool, to identify areas that may need some work in terms of, changes with process or reporting software or whatever, in the interest of us trying to identify. And Tom and I talked about this a little bit earlier. We've had 20 or 30 years, doing a lot of this manually with a lot of outdated systems. Now we've got, a director of finance who knows what right looks like and came from a big town and in a big finance practice. So I'd like to offer that as a potential tool for us to, fund and to use as a finance committee and as a leadership team, the council, to, along with the town manager, to help us identify areas for improvement. And also furthering the work we're trying to do in terms of line of sight and visibility to our financials, especially as we continue to take on bigger and bigger liabilities like the ones that involve the school and so forth.
Yeah, I'm supportive of that conceptually. Tom, have we ever done anything like that in your tenure, or?
Not during my tenure here, or no, but that is a separate engagement and a separate cost associated with that. That's not the annual audit. Certainly our audit firm would be capable of performing such.
Except that there's independence rules and we could not engage our independent auditor to do that kind of work.
They obviously have
There are
concerns about that in terms of being a separate practice area, but I think that, we certainly, have them as an option, and other local and perhaps even regional resources that, may have a practice like this that's, pretty deep in the municipal space. So
Have you done one of these types of audits in your full tenure as a
Um,
finance director?
we, down in Tulsa, we, started a Six Sigma process, and, we had a group of project managers get the black belt certification, and then they started pushing that down and training, interested employees on staff, and I made it to green belt. So I've got some. I'm not a full Six Sigma, but
green belt, the certification, not green belt, the part of a town, right?
right, exactly.
So the other thing that I think is an opportunity here is that Norm has obviously begun this work, as I mentioned earlier, and I think this would be a nice tie-in to the quarterly reviews that we're doing. So we have an ongoing look at this, and we can try to anticipate things and, with Tom's help and direction, prioritize, what we think needs attention and what's going to require, additional work for the council and for the public to get up to speed with. I mean, it's clear we're dealing with bigger, more complicated, matters. And I think the faster we raise our capability and our line of sight, I think we're gonna have an easier job building support for whatever we need to do.
I agree. So as you're getting familiar with how we have done things over the past several decades, I'm sure you're building a list in your mind
Yes.
of things you might want to pivot or change. And I think the sentiment here is that it will support you. So if you want to bring in, so if you need additional resources to execute some of that, then I think there's an appetite.
I've had a similar conversation with Norm. He said in the course of the audit work and his time so far with Scarborough, he's come upon some issues that aren't problematic, but just not the way he'd do it. And I said, well, you're finance director now, and I encourage you and Jen and Donna and his staff, I think equally are capable of questioning things. And so they have free license to not necessarily do it the way we always have. I'd like to know when they're changing a practice, but yeah, I think it's great to have this change of the guard and just a different set of eyes.
Good, great. Well, thank you for that.
Thanks.
Any members of the public that would like to comment on anything that we've talked about today or in general? Please come on up.
Thank you.
Marvin Gates, 423 Black Point Road. I went over talking about this most recent item that you were just discussing. And I, for clarification, went over the audit. Thankfully, it wasn't endless. And I did have, I mean, this will sound as though I'm putting in the form of questions. I realize you're not going to be answering my questions, but I just wanted to voice a couple of public concerns. And you've touched on 2 or 3 of them. What is that, $5 million for? Don, what you just said about they're staying neutral. So you really want a party that isn't neutral, that is really telling you what's up and what's down. I'm very supportive of that idea. I have, I'm going to call it a question. On page 8, indirect cost rate, the 10% de minimis indirect cost rate, it notes that Scarborough has elected not to use that. And my general question is, why has Scarborough elected not to use that? I don't expect an answer. It was something that I highlighted, and I'd be curious about it if you have that discussion in the future. The item 2022-001 of the in the material weakness department, the first one, that was, again, as a member of the public, of less concern to me. I'm sure it's of concern. The second one, though, 2022-002, and that's on page 11. Again, not fully informed, certainly not an accountant. However, when I read the potential effect on condition, and I'm going to read it, improper application of accounting principles could lead to inaccurate financial reporting and decision-making. And then it's like, exactly. You want to make the best decisions. We all do. We all want you to. And this is just a small red flag. I understand it as being in support of what you were just discussing and that Don brought up. Let's make sure that we don't fall down some rabbit hole that causes us to make decisions that none of us want you to make as far as quality is concerned. And then finally, in the, and I appreciate the time you're giving me, in the staff reply to both of those items, again, my thinking was, my concern was more around 2022-002. The last sentence of that reply is, we have formed a grant committee to review all grant awards for proper inclusion in the town's financial statements. And I would just be curious who the grant committee comprises. And thank you very much.
Thank you. Do we know? Who's on the grant committee? I wasn't invited.
Right now, it's the accounting division, but we're gonna be reaching out for others.
Okay.
And more than
Good
welcome,
questions. Thank you.
you're more than welcome to be on it.
Yeah, well, we'll see about that.
If you don't have anything better to do.
Always time, yeah, and energy for another.
I wasn't offering them.
And,
As exciting as it sounds.
And I would like to speak to the 10% de
Yeah.
minimis question. You have two choices when you have a grant for allocating your overhead costs. We pay our employees out of the general fund, obviously. But they do work on the grants, like, I do work when I prepare the CFA and we work with the auditors, so that's eligible costs that can be charged to the grant. If you choose the 10% de minimis, you just say 10% of the cost of the grant award, you can charge up to that to the grant. So you get $100,000 grant, you can charge 10,000 in overhead costs for
Administrative.
administrative.
Time.
And there's no questions asked. It's like the default safe harbor, if you will. The other option is you can charge specific costs to the grant that you can identify. And so if you've got an employee who's specifically or 50%, you can identify that works on that grant, you charge that to the grant. And what that allows you to do is recover more than 10% of the grant in your overhead. So it's a mechanism to allow you to recover more of your overhead costs than the 10% limit.
You just have to have the supporting.
You've got to have the support and it's got to stand up to the review. So that's the reason for choosing
And
not
that's in
to.
fact what we do, is we've
Yeah.
elected not to use the de minimis, right?
Right. And it allows us to recover more of those costs through a grant rather than paying for it out of general revenues in the general fund.
Well, I'm learning a lot today. Thank you for asking those questions. Any other public comment? Okay,
Could I just plant one seed? Staff has been working on updating impact fees, and one of the areas is school impact fee. There's a number of different kind of methodologies that we've developed, and we're not sure which one's right. I don't think there is a right or wrong. And so if you're inclined, I'd love to bring some of that work to this committee for review and your input as we move forward. I did commit to town council to bring the school impact fee and 2 or 3 others by October timeframe. So we've got a little time, but I'll work with the committee chair if you're interested in the subject matter to get it on a future agenda and just get your input, show you the work we've compiled and your input as to which is the path you'd like to follow.
I know we've talked a lot about this, and Tom, I thought that your initial report on this was very good. The one that you did a couple town council meetings ago. So I'm pleased to hear you taking the initiative to follow up on that.
nothing I would love more than to update our impact case, so please.
Good. We'll work with you on a future agenda.
Great.
Okay, thank you.
With that, do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
None opposed. We are adjourned. Great, thanks. Have a great evening, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Yes.